The 5 most terrifying creatures in the Bible, Part 1, the Leviathan. The Leviathan is the most famous legendary creature in the Bible. It is described as a ferocious beast that cannot be tamed. It is covered in impenetrable armor and has a mouth full of deadly teeth. Leviathan breathes fire and smoke and churns the sea like an inkwell. There is nothing on earth that can compare to it. Never hope to be able to overpower Leviathan. Because it is too strong, Leviathan has terrifying teeth. With scales arranged on its back like a sturdy armor shield, its eyes burn and sparkle like sunrise. Fiery breath that can make seawater boil, Leviathan's flesh is as hard as a stone. No weapon can penetrate. Leviathan is the king of the sea. Just like Behemoth, the creature born with Leviathan, it will be killed in the last days. I will regularly share useful Bible content on my YouTube channel, so please subscribe and turn on the notification bell so that I do not miss my videos. The origin of Leviathan. Leviathan is a sea serpent noted in theology and mythology. Leviathan, in Jewish mythology, is a primordial sea serpent. Its source is in pre-biblical Mesopotamian myth, especially that of the sea monster in the Ugaritic myth of Baal Siyam. In the Talmud, the Leviathan was created by God on the 5th day of creation. Seeing the creature's power, God left only one alive so that it could not procreate and destroy the rest of creation. Originally, God produced a male and a female Leviathan, but lest in multiplying the species should destroy the world, he slew the female. He reserved her flesh for the banquet given to the righteous on the advent of the Messiah, Baba Bathra 74a. The etymology of the name provides a hint. Though there is some speculation on this, the name Leviathan most likely means writhing or twisting one, which naturally suggests a snake-like creature. The other hint comes from the Septuagint or LXX, a Greek version of the Old Testament from the 2nd century BC. It translates Leviathan in the second divine speech in Job with Drakon, which also denotes a serpentine creature, and in English is dragon. Interestingly, the LXX translates the other instance of Leviathan in Job 3:8 with Kidos, a Greek-styled dragon that has a hog nose. The cumulative evidence certainly supports the idea that Leviathan is a sea dragon. The biblical descriptions of Leviathan also indicate it could be a type of tannin or sea monster. See Psalm 74:13-14, Isaiah 27:1 cf. Genesis 1:21. In ancient Near Eastern mythology, the tannin are concrete symbol for the sea, that God is described as defeating Psalm 74:13, and appear to represent chaos, disorder, and even evil itself. What does the Bible say about the Leviathan? Leviathan in the Old Testament. Biblical depictions of the Leviathan generally fall into one of two strains: terrifying monster linked to the devil, or magnificent creation of God, evidence of his greatness and power. The first mention of the whale occurs in Genesis, when on the 4th day God creates the creatures of the sea. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly, after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good." Genesis 1:20-21. The Leviathan makes appearances several times in the Hebrew Bible, as well as in the Talmud and other Jewish texts. It is referenced in several books of the Hebrew Bible, including Psalms, the book of Job, the book of Isaiah, and the pseudepigraphical book of Enoch. There are a handful of references to the Leviathan in the Old Testament. Most passages describe the Leviathan as a real creature, familiar to people who, of course, kept their distance by reputation if not by sight. In Psalm 1:04-25-26, God is praised as the one who created the habitat for the Leviathan. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There the ships go to and fro, and Leviathan, which you form to frolic there. Only a great God could have created Leviathan, and then made a place big enough for it to frolic safely. In Isaiah 27:1, the Leviathan is used as a symbol for the wicked kings of the earth who withstand God's people. The great power that wicked nations wield can be terrifying, but God assures his children that evil, no matter how monstrous, will be defeated in that day. The Lord will punish with his sword his fierce, great and powerful sword, Leviathan the gliding serpent, Leviathan the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. Psalm 74:14 contains a similar reference to God's victory over Leviathan in that psalm. The Pharaoh of Egypt is most likely Job 41 gives the most details about Leviathan as an actual sea creature. In that chapter, God describes Leviathan, emphasizing the animal's size, strength, and viciousness. The book of Job lists potential means of killing a whale. Job's faith in the justice of God begins to fail after enduring several trials at the hands of Satan. In response, God addresses Job directly, describing his most magnificent creations, the Behemoth and the Leviathan, to display his supreme power. God compares the Leviathan to a wild horse, claiming that the beast cannot be bridled. He also compares its heart to the nether millstone, a symbol of brute strength. Job 41:24. The Leviathan cannot be tied down or tamed. Job 41:1. 5. It is afraid to even look at verse 9. It is best left alone. Verses 8-10. The Leviathan has a graceful form. Verse 12, but is incredibly well protected with scales. Verses 13:15-17. Its chest is as impenetrable as its back. Verses 15-24. It has fearsome teeth. Verse 14. And death awaits anyone who approaches its mouth. Verses 18-21. Even mighty men are disenchanted by the Leviathan. Verse 25. No sword, spear, dart, javelin, arrow, stone, club, or lance can defeat it. Verses 26, 28-29. It cannot be caged because it breaks iron like straw. Verse 27. On land, the Leviathan leaves a trail of ruts in the water. It produces a deep, churning wake. Verses 30-32. God's description of the Leviathan concludes with a statement that it is the true king of the beasts. Nothing on earth is its equal, a creature without fear. Verse 33. So what animal is Job 41 describing? Some commentators believe Leviathan is a crocodile. Others believe it is a whale or a shark. Based on the biblical description, it seems more likely that Leviathan is a large sea reptile, possibly a species of dinosaur such as the plesiosaurus. Job's acquaintance with a dinosaur is not far-fetched at all, given that the book of Job is set in a very early time of history. The point God makes in Job 41 is that Leviathan is under God's sovereign control. Job had been questioned by God. Job 26-31, but God turned the tables and used Leviathan's might to emphasize Job's weakness and frailty. If God created Leviathan, an animal Job cannot stand before, then how great is God? Why is Job even trying to grapple with the Almighty? Leviathan was a dangerous creature that caused seasoned warriors to turn and run. Leviathan is no myth, but rather a real creature of the sea, subject only to its creator. As God says in his description of Leviathan, "Who then can stand against me? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me." Job 41:10-11. It also appears in the apocryphal book of Enoch, giving the following description of this monster's origins. They're mentioned as being female, as opposed to the male Behemoth. And that day 2 monsters are parted, one monster, a female named Leviathan, ordered to dwell in the abyss of the ocean over the fountains of water, and the other, a male called Behemoth, holds his chest in an invisible desert, whose name is Dundian, east of the Garden of Eden. 1 Enoch 67:8. Leviathan in the New Testament. The shadow of Leviathan is seen again as an enemy in Revelation 12-13, where a very Leviathan-like creature is described as a devouring dragon, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil in Satan 12:9. While the specific term Leviathan is not used in the book of Revelation, there are symbolic parallels between the sea monster Leviathan, as described in the Old Testament, and certain symbolic creatures mentioned in Revelation. In particular, with the sea monster in Revelation 13. And the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. Revelation 13:1-2. Some Jewish sources describe Leviathan as a dragon that lives on the sources of the abyss, and, along with the southern land monster Behemoth, will be of service to the righteous at the end of the world. This detail is quite consistent with the image of the dragon at the end of the world mentioned in the book of Revelation. This sea beast is often interpreted as a symbol of oppressive power or a manifestation of evil in the world. The parallels with Leviathan can be seen in the association with the sea and the multi-headed, powerful nature of the creature. The imagery of a monstrous sea creature arising from the sea evokes the symbolism of chaos. So just as Isaiah 27:1 prophesies, God will slay the fleeing Leviathan to end chaos once and for all. He is to be thrown into a lake of fire, Rev 20:10, along with death itself, Rev 20:14. and the universe will become all it was meant to be and more. God will create a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. Rev 21:1, and with it, all that the sea represented. Leviathan and therefore chaos will die. Satan will die, and death itself will die. God has crushed Leviathan's 7 heads and given him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. Psalm 74:14. All that will live will be of God and his order. In this instance, God is described as having defeated the Leviathan in a triumph of good over evil. The Leviathan becomes food for the people inhabiting the wilderness, facing the same fate as Poulter's whale. The Christian interpretation of Leviathan is often considered to be a demon or natural monster associated with Satan or the devil, and held by some to be the same monster as Rahab. Isaiah 51:9. Some interpreters suggest that Leviathan is a symbol of humankind in opposition to God, claiming that it and the beasts mentioned in the books of Daniel and Revelation should be interpreted as metaphors. The Septuagint also casts the Leviathan and Behemoth, another biblical monster, in a negative light, with the explanation that both were created to be mocked by angels. LXX Job 40:19-41-24. This negative view of Leviathan continues in early Christianity, the early church father, John Chrysostom, being an exception, and into the medieval age, where Leviathan becomes a major symbol for Satan and is often depicted as Hellmouth, the gaping jaws of Leviathan forming the very gates of hell. A favorite iconographic motif is of Jesus stabbing the devil with a long staffed cross in one hand, and with the other hand pulling Adam and Eve and the rest of the patriarchs out of Leviathan's cavernous mouth. Christ is usually depicted as grabbing Adam's wrist instead of his hand, to indicate that Adam's salvation is dependent on Christ alone. Symbol of Leviathan. In the book of Job, the Leviathan is presented as one of the most enigmatic and powerful creatures described in the Bible. This formidable sea monster, depicted with vivid imagery, plays a crucial role in the narrative of Job and conveys deep theological and philosophical meanings. Through its portrayal, the Leviathan becomes a symbol of God's unmatched power and wisdom, while also representing the chaotic and untamable aspects of creation. The ocean churns and boils at his passing. This portrait not only emphasizes Leviathan's power, but also serves as a humbling reminder of human limitations in the face of the creativity of God. In the Psalms and Isaiah, the Leviathan is a symbol of chaos and divine retribution. Images of Leviathan change slightly. Psalm 74 depicts God striking Leviathan's head and giving it as food to the creatures in the desert, symbolizing God's victory over chaos. Meanwhile, Isaiah 27 presents a prophetic vision in which Leviathan, the twisted serpent, is slain by God at the end of the day, cementing its role as a symbol of chaos and evil that ultimately refuses to float divine order. Analyzing textual symbolism. Every mention of Leviathan is filled with symbolism in these texts. Leviathan is not only a creature but also a metaphor for the chaos and disorder that exists in the world, chaos that, according to the biblical texts, can only be subjugated by a power greater than itself. Scholars and theologians often debate whether Leviathan represents a real-world phenomenon, or the philosophical concept of evil and chaos controlled by divine power. As we explore these passages, we see how ancient cultures used Leviathan to explain the inexplicable, attributing natural disasters and sea storms to the stirrings of the mighty beast. This segment will take a closer look at the original Hebrew texts, seeking insight from experts to unravel the layers of meaning embedded in these ancient words. Portrait of Leviathan in the Bible. Beyond the physical, it is alive, the embodiment of the fears and unknowns that ancient peoples faced. As we conclude this passage, we recognize Leviathan's role in illustrating the message that strength and order ultimately come from God, a central theme of the spiritual teachings of the time. Leviathan has revealed the textual portrait of a biblical titan. After we delve into the mythical presence of Leviathan, let us now turn to the ancient texts, where the creature is vividly portrayed with formidable characteristics that have captivated scholars and believers. In this segment, we explore the detailed and often difficult descriptions of Leviathan, as presented in the book of Job, one of the oldest books of the Hebrew Bible. The terrifying nature of the creature is most comprehensively described in Job 41. God describes the work of the Leviathan as a creature beyond human domination, a powerful being with unparalleled strength and impermeable armor. The scales are described as his pride, sealed tightly together. When Leviathan rises, the mighty are very afraid, and they retreat in fear. Here, Leviathan is not merely a sea creature, but a symbol of the overwhelming and untamable forces of nature. Furthermore, we find references to Leviathan in the Psalms and Isaiah, where the creature takes on a more symbolic role. In these books, Leviathan is portrayed as an embodiment of chaos, a being whom God defeats as a demonstration of his divine power over the unruly forces of the world. Beyond the book of Job, Leviathan appears in Psalms and Isaiah, where it takes on a symbolic role. In Psalm 74:14, the psalmist recounts God's triumph over the Leviathan. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. This passage highlights Leviathan as a symbol of chaos and disorder, with God's victory over it representing divine control over the forces of chaos. Isaiah 27:1 further cements this symbolism. In that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. Here, Leviathan represents cosmic chaos which God ultimately subdues, demonstrating his supreme authority and power. These texts illustrate the recurring biblical theme of God's triumph over chaos, bringing order to the cosmos. Leviathan, God's first worst enemy. From the reputation Satan has gained over the last 2 millennia, you might think he was God's original nemesis. But long before there was a Christian devil, God had a first worst enemy, the great mythical sea monster, best known by the name Leviathan. The cosmic showdown of God versus the sea monster has roots deep beneath the biblical texts. Among the colorful variety of ancient Southwest Asian traditions of gods battling sea monsters is even a Canaanite myth in which the god Baal kills the monstrous sea serpent Leviathan, whose name and description are echoed in the Bible. Most of the time when the Bible mentions the sea monster, it's getting its head bashed in. For instance, Psalm 74 offers a dramatic description of God's defeat of the monster. Before that resolution, things aren't looking too good for God's people. The psalm describes how enemies have violated the sanctuary, taken axes to it, and set it on fire. The poet has one hope, that God will conquer Israel's enemies like he vanquished his own. You split the sea, with your strength you shattered the heads of sea monsters upon the water. You smashed down the heads of Leviathan, you gave him as food to the people, to the desert creatures. Psalm 74:13-14. This monster is so forbidding that the mere memory of God's ancient victory over it is meant to reassure people looking at their hacked up, burned down sacred space. It's hard not to come off as forbidding when you have a lot of heads. God smashes the heads, yes, plural, of Leviathan. God is cracking skulls, and it's not enough just to crush the multiple heads, so God also desecrates the sea monster's corpse. God feeds its carcass to the people dwelling in the desert, picking up the corpse and chucking it a few miles inland, with leftovers for the wild animals. An oracle in Isaiah also calls up the memory of God's ancient victory over the sea monster. Isaiah uses another name for the monster, Rahab, no relation to the biblical woman, whose name looks the same in English, but is different in Hebrew. Awake, awake, put on strength, arm of the Lord. Awake, as in the days of old, generations of long ago. Was it not you who hacked Rahab to pieces, who pierced the sea monster? Isaiah 51:9. While Psalm 74 has God in unarmed combat with the sea monster, crushing its many rearing heads, here God is armed. God chops up the sea monster, piercing it with some divine weapon we can only imagine. In both of these scenes, God's vanquishing of the sea monster is securely in the distant past. But the best monsters never stay dead, and Leviathan is God's forever foe. Fought and slain in days already ancient to the biblical writers, the sea monster promises to resurface for another round, destined to be slain again. God's conclusive victory is still to come. In another part of Isaiah, the prophet declares, "On that day, God with his fierce and huge and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he will kill the sea monster that is in the sea." Isaiah 27:1. The irony of the forever fight is that through an assurance that God will slay the monster in a showdown, the monster grows even larger. It won't be killed only once, it's like a recurring nightmare. God will always have to battle this monster. This primordial creature is the Hebrew Bible's poster child for the dangerous looming enemy that must be defeated, so much so that Egypt and other regional enemies are sometimes referred to metaphorically as sea monsters. It's no wonder, then, that in the New Testament the sea monster develops from the great enemy into the enemy, and the evolution is spectacular. The sea monster becomes a giant red dragon with 7 heads, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. Rev 12:3, 9:22. Where the Hebrew Bible refers to the sea monster, or even to Leviathan by name, the Septuagint, the Greek version used by New Testament writers, uses the word dragon. The descriptions in Revelation of the devil as a giant ancient dragon and serpent are lifted from Isaiah, where Leviathan is both serpent and sea monster, or, in the Septuagint, serpent and dragon Isaiah 27:1. The sea monster has become the very picture of the devil. You know you're bad to the bone when you make a good template for the Prince of Darkness. He is slaying, smashing, crushing, piercing. From the first clash to the final epic battle, everything would lead us to expect consistent animosity between God and this enemy. But God's proclivities are never quite what we expect. As it turns out, God also delights in his sea monster. In Psalm 104, Leviathan is praised as a thing of wonder. The psalm marvels at creation. God stretched out the heavens like a tent, set the earth on its foundations, covered it with the ancient deep like a garment, and made the streams flow. There are branches for birds and grass for cattle. God made the moon and sun, darkness and light. Wild animals prowl at night, and people work all day until the evening comes. If this sounds familiar, it's because the first 23 verses of the psalm name almost every facet of creation from Genesis 1. But in Genesis, the pinnacle of creation is humankind. The poet of Psalm 104 takes a very different view of the culmination of God's creation. Lord, how many are your works? In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. There is the sea, great and wide, creeping things without number are there, living creatures small and great. Their ships go, and Leviathan, whom you formed to play with him. Psalm 104:24-26. Here the pinnacle of creation is Leviathan. In Genesis, God finishes with humankind, having finally created something in his image. Gen 1:26-27. In this psalm, God finishes with Leviathan having finally created his companion. And there's more, he's God's pet. In one Talmudic reading of this verse, God plays with Leviathan for 3 hours a day. The poet continues, directly following up the praise of Leviathan among all God's creatures. All of them look to you to give them their food in due season. You give to them and they gather it up. You open your hand, and they are satisfied with good things. P.S. 104:27-28. How recently we saw God slaughtering Leviathan, crushing the multiple heads of the ancient monster, and feeding his carcass to the people of the desert. And yet, here is God now, playing with Leviathan and feeding the monster out of his open hand. A trusting pet looks to God for food and care. Also, heads are smacked down onto the surface of the water. A creature is pierced, and a monstrous serpent twists and speeds through the deep. We've seen the sea monster from two very different angles, yet we've hardly caught a glimpse of the monster's body. There is one place in the Bible where an extended, graphic description of Leviathan appears. It happens in the book of Job. After losing his livelihood, watching his children die, and being tortured with physical agony, Job repeatedly cries out to God. Near the end of the book, God finally responds to the bereaved, tormented subject of his experiment, but only to say, "Gird up your loins like a man." Job 38:3. With those opening words, God delivers a litany of rhetorical questions that run through the whole of creation, a lot like Psalm 104. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Job 38:4. Have you seen the storehouses of hail that I've saved for a time of trouble? 38:22-23. After cataloging the waters, the stars, and so on, God moves on to the animal kingdom. After the mountain goats and the ostriches, just as we're expecting to find human beings as the crown of creation, we instead meet something very different. In the praise of creation in Psalm 104, Leviathan found his place of pride after humankind. God's speech in Job one-ups this, leaving out human beings altogether. As his long, glorious finale, God describes Leviathan. Can you pull out Leviathan with a fish hook? Can you put a rope in his nose? Will he speak soft words to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him like a bird? Will you spear him, harpoon him, and let the traders haggle over him? Job 41:1-7. The contrast with God's earlier rhetorical questions about the earth is jarring. Those questions pointed to God's control over creation. He determined the earth's measurements and made the boundaries of the sea. Job 38:5-8. Now God's questions emphasize how Leviathan is beyond all control. Some interpreters suggest that these questions point to things that Job can't do but God can, an idea with a high theological comfort quotient. It has additional appeal as well, since the image of God playing with Leviathan like a bird would tie in nicely with Psalm 104, where God created Leviathan to play with him. But swirled together within this series of questions, God also asks whether Leviathan speaks softly to Job and makes a covenant with him. If God's rhetorical questions suggest that he could harness Leviathan, then they also suggest that Leviathan speaks tenderly to God, and that the two have a covenant. Neither option is particularly comforting. Either God created a monster beyond his control and let him loose, or he plays with Leviathan while the sea monster whispers sweet nothings in his ear. God has some last words of advice before coming to the climax of his speech. First, he warns of Leviathan's power. Lay a hand on him once, God says, and you'll never try it again. No one's so fierce that he should try to rouse the monster. Job 41:8-10. Then God veers off into threats and warnings about his power, like a man puffing up his chest as he heatedly steps in to defend his beloved. Who then will stand before me? Who will confront me, and I'll repay him? Under the whole of heaven, who? 41:10-11. Try me, says God. Come at me. With this, God turns to an awe-filled description of Leviathan. I will not keep silent concerning his limbs, his mighty power, and his incomparable form, who can strip off his outer garment, who can penetrate his double coat of armor, who can open the doors of his face, his teeth of terror all around. His back is rows of shields closed up with a tight seal, coming one after another so that not a breath can come between them. One is fused to the next, they clasp each other and cannot be separated. 41:12-17. These details are alarming. Leviathan's giant jaws open wide to reveal terrifying teeth all around. The Hebrew means encircling those jaws are the doors of his face, not just the doors of the mouth, as in other poetry, e.g. Micah 7:5, but giant doors that open up the whole face. His enormous jaws are heavy and powerful, impossible to pry open. His scales are like impenetrable fused shields, and that's just one of the two layers. Leviathan seems more crocodilian than serpentine, but with utterly unnatural features that take him far outside the scope of any living creature. His fantastic monstrosity becomes more glaring as God continues. His sneezes flash forth light, his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire escape. Out of his nostrils comes smoke, like a basket with bulrushes ablaze. His breath could kindle coals, flame comes out of his mouth. In his neck lodges strength, terror dances before him. The folds of his flesh cleave together, hard cast and immovable. His chest is hard as a rock, hard as the bottom, grinding stone. When he rises, God's fear. At the crash, they are beside themselves. Job 41:18-25. Leviathan breathes fire. It's like a blowtorch from his fang-ringed mouth and smoke from his nose. His eyes glow red like the first glimmer of dawn. And he has a neck of brute strength. Even the folds of his flesh, literally the drooping parts, are hard cast, in Hebrew a word used to describe metal. His chest is like the hardest stone, the one that's used to grind other things to smithereens. This section of the poem ends with a vivid image of the sea monster rising and hitting the water again with a thundering splash. Remember the good old days when the image of Leviathan hitting the water was invoked in celebration of his defeat, like the scene of a cosmic action flick where God finally vanquishes the monster. You shattered the heads of sea monsters upon the water, you smacked down the heads of Leviathan. P.S. 74:13-14. This time is different. Leviathan lifts himself out of the water in God fear. At his crashing back down, even the gods panic. Here God pauses for an interlude about how no weapon forged against Leviathan can stand. Even if a spear were to reach him, it would break. Iron and bronze are like straw and rotten wood to him. Cudgels and sling stones like wind-blown chaff. Job 41:26-29. Then God has one more part of Leviathan to describe. His underparts are like the sharpest of potsherds. He crawls like a threshing sled in the mud. He makes the deep boil like a cauldron. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. Behind him, he leaves a shining wake. One would think the deep to be white-haired. He has no equal upon the earth, a created thing without fear. He looks upon everything lofty. He is king over all the proud. 41:30-34. Leviathan's belly is so jagged and sharp that he cuts into the ground as he crawls. That's right, the ground. This sea monster can come out of the ocean straight toward you, like that girl in the ring crawling out of the TV. He crawls up onto the land, scraping as he goes. If there is any lingering question about how monstrous Leviathan is, here's another clue: he boils the deep as he swims through it. His body also leaves the sea like a pot of ointment, whatever that means. Maybe he oozes slime. He shoots through the water, leaving a shining wake. Leviathan has no equal. God concludes he is the only created thing with no fear. He is unparalleled, reigning over all. In all of God's speeches in the Bible, nothing compares to this 23-verse description of Leviathan's incredible body, part by part. In the biblical speeches of humans, though, something compares. It's in Song of Songs. The lover describes his beloved's form in intimate detail, savoring each part, poetically exploring her whole body with amazement. How beautiful you are, my darling, how beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats moving down Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing. Song 412. He continues, describing her lips and mouth, then her temples and her neck, and then her breasts. The young woman in turn describes her beloved, first his skin, then his head and hair, his eyes, cheeks, and lips, and then continuing downward, his arms are rods of gold, set with topaz. His belly is a panel of ivory, inlaid with lapis lazuli. His thighs are alabaster pillars, set upon foundations of gold. 5:14-15. To most readers of the Bible, this form of poetry may seem unique to the Song of Songs, but it isn't. This slow gaze down the loved one's body, pausing to praise each place the eye falls, is a well-known genre of poetry called a wash Arabic for description. A snippet of an ancient Egyptian reads, long of the neck, white of breast, her hair true lapis lazuli. Her arms surpass gold, her fingers are like lotuses. This poetic form would have been familiar to ancient readers. Think about how we recognize the tone of a limerick by its familiar contours. When we hear "there once was a girl from Nantucket," we know generally what sort of poetry we're dealing with. We know the genre, and we know to expect something light-hearted and likely a ham discourteous. Similarly, an ancient reader or listener would recognize the tone of a waf and understand the sentiments it conveys. When God describes Leviathan's body to Job as if gazing slowly over each part, this is not a biology lesson. It's a wash. That doesn't mean it's sexual, like in the Come Hither Song of Songs, but it is positively an expression of intimate knowledge and passionate love. God's poem is an expression of love, and he lingers over every detail. Contrast this with how God relates to Job. The first part of God's speech is already dismissive, jettisoning humankind from the survey of creation. Then the Leviathan twists the knife. Job has cried out, pleading for God to respond, devastated at God's utter silence. When God finally answers, he says that his heart belongs to another. Leaving the poet of Psalm 104 in the dust, Job's God swaps out any description of humankind for a classic descriptive love poem about the infamous sea monster. Only in that relationship, and his own effusive words, God's allegiance comes into painfully sharp focus. We finally know where we stand. To be fair, Leviathan is a better match for God. People can be so moral. God identifies with the monstrous. Leviathan can never be tamed, and neither can God. Cultural and theological interpretations. The Leviathan's representation has been the subject of much scholarly debate. Some scholars argue that Leviathan could represent real phenomena, such as actual sea creatures or natural disasters. Others view it as a philosophical concept, embodying evil and chaos that are controlled by divine authority. Leviathan's portrayal as a metaphor for chaos provided ancient cultures with a framework for understanding natural disasters and other unexplainable events. The chaotic nature of the Leviathan is a reflection of the unpredictability of life and the human struggle to find order amidst turmoil. This interpretation underscores the theological belief in God's sovereignty and his ability to bring order out of chaos. The Leviathan is a powerful symbol in the Bible, appearing in several books and representing chaos, evil, and divine sovereignty. In the books of Psalms and Isaiah, the Leviathan is depicted not only as a physical creature, but also as a symbol of cosmic disorder and the embodiment of chaos that God ultimately overcomes. These references highlight God's power over chaos and evil, portraying the Leviathan as an instrument through which God's strength and authority are demonstrated. In the Book of Psalms, the Leviathan is mentioned in two significant passages, both of which illustrate its symbolic role in expressing themes of chaos, order, and divine victory. Psalm 74:12-14, "But God is my king from long ago, he brings salvation on the earth. It was you who split open the sea with your power, you broke the heads of the monsters in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert." In this passage, the Leviathan represents the chaotic forces of the sea, which are often seen as adversaries to God's ordered creation. The imagery of God crushing the heads of the Leviathan signifies a victory over chaos and evil. The act of breaking the heads of Leviathan symbolizes God's triumph over the forces that oppose his will and his ability to maintain order in the universe. This victory is a testament to God's sovereignty and power, reinforcing the idea that he is in control of all creation. Psalms 1:04-24-26, "How many are your works, Lord? In wisdom you made them all, the earth is full of your creatures. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There the ships go to and fro, and Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there." In this passage, the Leviathan is portrayed not as a threat but as a part of God's creation, existing within the vast and expansive sea. Here, the Leviathan represents the majesty and mystery of God's works. Its presence in the sea emphasizes the idea that even the most formidable and mysterious creatures are under God's dominion. This depiction highlights God's wisdom in creation and his ability to maintain balance and harmony within the natural world. It also serves as a reminder of the complexity and diversity of life that God has created, where even chaos has its place and purpose. In the book of Isaiah, the Leviathan is used as a metaphor for the enemies of God and his people, as well as a representation of chaos and evil that God will ultimately defeat. Isaiah 27:1, "In that day the Lord will punish with his sword is fierce. Great and powerful sword, Leviathan the gliding serpent. Leviathan the coiling serpent, he will slay the monster of the sea." Here, the Leviathan is depicted as a serpent and a monster of the sea, embodying the forces of evil and chaos that threaten God's order. The gliding and coiling nature of the serpent suggests its elusive and dangerous qualities. The act of God slaying the Leviathan with his sword signifies his ultimate victory over these chaotic forces. This passage emphasizes God's authority and power, portraying him as the divine warrior who will vanquish all that opposes his will. The symbolism in Isaiah also carries eschatological themes, suggesting a future time when God will decisively intervene in history to bring about justice and righteousness. The destruction of the Leviathan represents the triumph of good over evil and the establishment of God's kingdom. This imagery provides hope and reassurance to the faithful, affirming that God's power is greater than any force of chaos or evil that they may encounter. The Leviathan in contemporary culture. Popular culture has continued to preserve the notion of Leviathan as a huge, monstrous creature. I give one recent example. In the second season of Disney's ongoing television series, The Mandalorian, the first episode, which aired on 30th October 2020, features a sand dragon that eats bovine creatures called banthas, behemoths. The dragon is eventually called a Leviathan, and after it is killed, its meat is eaten as a delicacy. It seems we've come full circle. As you can see from this quick sweep through history, there has never been a settled answer to what the Leviathan is. While it doesn't give us a neat zoological classification, the Leviathan offers us something else. As a symbol of chaos and strength, it gave the biblical writers a means to speak about the greater power of their God. As a formidable adversary and ancient monster from ancient myth, it helps to put the Psalms, Isaiah, and Job in their ancient Near Eastern literary and cultural contexts. As a terrifying creature of immense proportions, whose mention brings with it a shiver of fear and awe, it continues to capture imaginations and even today maintains its mystery. The Leviathan, with its enigmatic presence and formidable strength, stands as a testament to the enduring power of biblical imagery and its capacity to convey profound truths about the world and our place within it. This creature, depicted as a symbol of chaos and divine retribution, challenges us to confront our fears and acknowledge the complexities of the natural world. The Leviathan's legacy extends beyond its biblical origins, influencing art, literature, and cultural narratives throughout history. As we continue to explore the terrifying creatures of the Bible in this series, Let us remember the lessons that the Leviathan imparts, that even in the face of chaos and uncertainty, there is an ultimate order guided by divine authority. May the story of the Leviathan inspire us to seek understanding, embrace the mysteries of creation, and find solace in the power of faith.